Class is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Involving Stakeholders in Nitrogen Rate Research to Improve Profitability and Water Quality. My name is Julia Freuk. I am the project coordinator here at the Partnership for Ag Resource Management and will be hosting the webinar this morning. We are joined today by my colleague, Mark Adeslperger, Resource Management Specialist for the Partnership of Ag Resource Management, who will provide a brief introduction. I'm also pleased to welcome our guest speaker, Jeffrey Vetsch, researcher at University of Minnesota's Southern Research and Outreach Center. Before we begin, I will go over some brief logistics. Please make use of the question box on your screen to type questions for Jeffrey during his presentation. I will moderate the questions during the last 10 to 15 minutes of the webinar after the presentation. We suggest viewing the webinar while connected via Ethernet for best audio quality performance. You will receive an email in the next few days with the webinar recording and a webinar evaluation. The recording will also be available on partnershipfarm.org. By attending today's webinar, you are eligible for 1.5 CCA continuing education units, 1 for nutrient management and 0.5 for soil and water management. You must be present for the entire webinar to receive those points. If you submitted your CCA number at registration and are watching the webinar live, no further action is required to submit your CEUs. If you are watching this on demand at a later date, please be sure to watch the entire presentation through the GoToWebinar platform and not YouTube to receive credit. You must submit your CCA number at registration to receive CEUs. If you watch the webinar recording more than 2 weeks after the original broadcast, please email julia@partnershipfarm.org your CCA number to ensure your credits are submitted. Please make a big note that credits often take a few weeks to appear in your account. If it has been more than 3 weeks, please contact my email. And now, with the logistics taken care of, I will turn it over to Mark, Resource Management Specialist for the Partnership for Ag Resource Management.
Thanks, Julia, and thanks to everyone for joining us today. The Partnership for Ag Resource Management is an effort of our nonprofit IPM Institute, along with many other projects in agriculture and communities, each focused on using the power of the marketplace to improve sustainability. Our team of 23 is currently working to increase adoption of best practices and improve outcomes in health, environment, and economics, all key elements of sustainability. IPM works with pest control companies, hospitals, schools, and other facilities in communities. We also work with food companies and farmers around the world to improve practices and performance and to communicate those benefits to buyers and the public. Our goal with the Partnership for Ag Resource Management is to collaborate with ag retailers to identify and promote revenue-generating products and services that keep inputs on cropland. We track sales of these services through annual surveys and calculate estimated nutrient loss reductions for several of these. We then provide an individual nutrient stewardship report to participating ag retailers that compares location info with aggregate state and basin-wide data. An overall survey report is also provided. We work with retailers and industry associations to publicize survey results through press releases and articles. It's important to get the positive news out there to address misperceptions the public has about agriculture. We're all aware of the water quality challenges we face, from the record-breaking algal blooms in the western Lake Erie Basin to the expansive hypoxic zones in the Gulf of Mexico. Increased levels of phosphorus in the water feed algal bloom growth, which closes beaches to swimming, makes fishing a challenge, and have also shut down public water supplies. We know phosphorus runoff is coming primarily from cropland because of the timing of the loads. They spike during snowmelt and rain events in winter and early spring, following fall applications. The graph on the left shows the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration's annual data on algal bloom severity since 2002. We can see on average that algal blooms are becoming more frequent and severe, making it increasingly important to convey the economic and environmental benefits of products and services like cover crops and variable rate application to help retain nutrients on fields. Many ag retailers are working to improve water quality. Our annual surveys show substantial increases in several products and services that helps keep inputs on cropland, including variable rate phosphorus application, which has increased from 17% of acres serviced in 2011 to 66% in the Sandusky River watershed. In 2015, the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation and the EPA's Great Lakes Restoration Initiative, we secured funding for ag retailers in the watershed to offer a discount on variable rate technology to farmers who had not used it before. We've had more than 30 ag retailers and 250 growers representing more than 20,000 acres participate in the program. Using published estimates, serviced acres utilizing VRT in this graph kept more than 525,000 pounds of phosphorus and over 1 million pounds of nitrogen from leaving cropland in the watershed. It is vital that we track and report the improvements retailers are making so that regulators and the public are aware of these voluntary efforts. With that, Julia, I'd like to turn the mic back to you.
Thank you, Mark. Our team also provides free resources for ag retailer employees, grower clients, and consultants, available on our website, partnershipfarm.org. On the left is our continually updated and 4R approved agronomist handbook, available free for download. The handbook includes algal bloom updates, trends in customer product and service adoption, and fact sheets for your grower customers to increase awareness of products and services that reduce nutrient runoff. Our phosphorus loss reduction wallet cards are on the right, can be also ordered for free on our website. These are a great conversation starter with your customers and can also serve as handouts in meetings. To date, we have distributed more than 25,000. Our next two webinars will occur in February. Our upcoming webinar on the 4th is the second in the Great Lakes Conservation Connect series and will discuss the economics of renting and owning American farmland. A second webinar will take place in late February and is part of our regular PARM series, topic and date to be determined. Please note that we take into consideration your suggestions for webinar topics, so be sure to fill out our evaluation form after the webinar. Don't forget to take our 2018 Annual Ag Retailer Survey. This survey is vital for our ag industry and your location, and we need your responses this week. Look for the survey link in our follow-up email or on our website. Please be sure to take only one survey per ag retailer branch or location. By participating in the survey, you'll receive an individual report detailing your phosphorus and nitrogen loss reductions from specific products and services, along with an aggregate report that incorporates all survey respondent data. Names and locations are kept anonymous. We also invite you to follow us on Facebook and Twitter for PARM updates and industry news. Now, we'll get the presentation started with Jeffrey Vetsch, researcher at University of Minnesota's Southern Research and Outreach Center.
Good morning.
Looks good, Jeff.
Good morning, everyone. First off, I'd like to recognize my co-authors, Dawn Bernal and Kevin Keener of the Minnesota Department of Agriculture, and Gregory Klinger and Jake Overgaard of the University of Minnesota Extension Service. Our topic today is simple and very straightforward. Farmers, ag advisors, state agency staff, and university researchers all working together to improve agriculture productivity and protect water quality in southeastern Minnesota. But this is a challenging task due to the way water behaves in this region. This region called the driftless region, a region where surface waters, our streams and rivers, and the groundwater in our bedrock are connected. Much of the water that flows over the land and into the region's streams will sink underground into our bedrock, and some of that water that flows through the pores and cracks and caves in that bedrock will eventually return into the streams and rivers. Sometimes these connections are obvious and dramatic, such as that stream sinking into the cave system on the left, and other times they are not as obvious. The problem or the concern that we have is well testing has found elevated nitrate levels in groundwater. The chart on the left shows the percentage of wells in this region that test greater than the 10 milligram per liter nitrate nitrogen level. The reason for this is nitrate moves well and easily with water through these permeable soils and into this fractured bedrock and directly to groundwater. The land use in this region is primarily agricultural, lots of corn and soybeans and livestock. But also in the bluff areas, there's lots of trees and forested areas. I grew up in this region, and it was dominated by small livestock farms prior to the 1990s and had much less row crop agriculture than it does today. The forages and small grains, alfalfa and pastures that were there in the 70s and 80s helped minimize some of these water quality concerns. Our goal today is to improve water quality by increasing adoption of nitrogen best management practices in this region. Our approach that we used in our research and education efforts was to work closely with farmers and their ag advisors to increase their confidence in and adoption of these region-specific nitrogen BMPs. We did this by utilizing on-farm research and education efforts. We emphasize small group face-to-face education and in small group field days and farmer meetings. We focused this effort primarily on choosing the right nitrogen rate for corn production in this region, but also looked at the effects of application timing of nitrogen in this area. Our approach was we had the Southeast Minnesota Nitrogen BMP project, and this project was a multitude of smaller projects all nestled under one umbrella. It involved farmers, their ag advisors. They worked closely with researchers and extension and agency staff to find research projects that would fit their needs on their farms. Some of these projects were replicated strip trials that only had 2 to 3 or 4 treatments that the farmers were interested in. Others were detailed research experiments that had intensive sampling and detailed analysis. And ultimately, the data that was collected was shared with these growers and also with the greater public. And the growers were encouraged to look at information from other growers' farms that were their neighbors and in the other areas in the region. The Southeast Minnesota NBMP project is really part of 3 projects. This nutrient management initiative, these are on-farm field length strip trials that are greater than 1/2 an acre in size, usually just 2 or 4 treatments that are chosen by the farmer or their advisor as they work together. These are replicated or randomized on the farm fields with the commercial-sized equipment, and the results are shared with the participants and the other growers that are involved in the NMI project. We had detailed nitrogen rate and timing studies that were done. These were the plots that I was most involved in. These were on-farm, small plot, N-rate response trials with 10 treatments, intensive sampling of plant parts and grain, and also the data were shared with all the stakeholders and also entered into the MRTN database, which I'll mention earlier and discuss at greater detail. The third component of this project was water quality monitoring. There were multiple sites within watersheds. We had edge of field and in-stream measurements, and we were looking at the runoff, weather climatic data, sediment, nitrogen, and phosphorus loads to the area streams and watersheds. During this period from 2015 through 2018, and this the Southeast Minnesota MBMP project is continuing in 2019. We have had over 100 farmers, over 40 crop advisors be involved, many for 2 or 3 growing seasons in this study. We've conducted over 165 NMI plots and 12 intensive nitrogen rate trials, and have held 30 educational events to work at looking at this data, interpreting it, and explaining it to growers, and helping better understand how we can implement these BMPs and hopefully improve our water quality in this region. Each of these projects had their own objectives. The NMI projects were looking at evaluating alternative nitrogen practices of interest for each farmer on their farm, and then comparing those practices to other participants in the study. These practices were evaluated for their potential to improve yield and profitability for the farmer, and also help the farmer manage risk that might be associated with either nitrogen loss or a yield reduction due to not adequate nitrogen. At the same time, our primary goal was to also help minimize nitrate losses to ground and surface waters in this region. Some of the projects were focused on highlighting advances in nitrogen management and technology. The objectives of the nitrogen rate and timing studies were very simple. We measured the effects of nitrogen rate and application timing on corn production, nitrogen use efficiency, net return to fertilizer nitrogen, and as a water quality parameter, we looked at residual soil nitrate, or the amount of soil nitrate that was remaining in the soil profile after harvest. We then calculated the economic optimum nitrogen rate, and we used it in our MRTN database, which we'll discuss shortly. Minnesota breaks down their different geographic regions, and we have region-specific nitrogen BMPs for each region. These are based on the soils and the geology in the region, and also on the climate that's specific to that region. In southeastern Minnesota, the recommended practice are first and foremost to select an appropriate nitrogen rate for corn. That total nitrogen rate should include nitrogen applied in other fertilizers, like starter fertilizers and ammoniated fertilizers. We encourage or recommend spring pre-plant applications of anhydrous ammonia and urea, or split applications of all nitrogen sources. We also encourage that we take appropriate credit for previous legume crops and manure used in the crop rotation, and to minimize direct movement of surface waters to sinkholes in the area. Things that are not recommended in this region of the state: fall application of fertilizer nitrogen and application of nitrogen fertilizer on frozen soils. How do we make our nitrogen rate guidelines in Minnesota? And why is that important? Choosing the right nitrogen rate for corn is probably the single most difficult fertilizer decision a farmer and their crop advisor makes. And that's primarily due to the nitrogen has the greatest economic impact or return of any nutrient that we apply to the field. If we're short, we're going to hurt yields, and that is going to cost the farmer more money. We need to look at these credits. We have manure credits, we have legume credits, we might have effects of nitrogen efficiency based on cover crop effects, and also, as mentioned earlier, we have nitrogen and other fertilizers. We ask farmers, we as nutrient management researchers and scientists, we ask farmers to work with their crop advisors, compare their nitrogen rates to the University of Minnesota guidelines as developed by the Corn Nitrogen Rate Calculator, which can be found at the website in blue. What is the Corn Nitrogen Rate Calculator? It's a method used, a regional Corn Belt-wide approach to making nitrogen rate guidelines. Really what it is a database of end rate response trials that are used to help determine what the optimum rate is based on conditions and inputted values. When you click on the Start button, this is the first screen. It allows you to choose the state or region of a state that you're working in, the crop rotation, in this case corn following soybeans, and then set some input prices because it's an economically driven database. Here I've chosen anhydrous ammonia as my nitrogen source. I've put in the cost per ton to get a nitrogen price per pound of N, and I've estimated what my fertilizer price or what my corn value would be at the point of sale. This creates a nitrogen price to corn price ratio. When you hit calculate, it shows you several different things and gives you a recommendation. First of all, we're going to talk about the chart at the bottom of the page. On the y-axis is the return to nitrogen in dollars per acre. On the x-axis is nitrogen rate as a response function from corn production. The green line at the bottom of the screen is the fertilizer cost based on nitrogen rate. As rates increase, fertilizer costs increase in a linear fashion based on the price inputs that we submitted earlier. The blue line at the top is the response function of corn in gross return. As the first increments of nitrogen fertilizer give the greatest economic returns, but we reach a point of diminishing returns, where the last increments of fertilizer nitrogen do not increase gross return and yields tend to plateau, and it's usually fit to a quadratic plateau type response model. The red line is the difference between these two lines. This is the maximum return to nitrogen. The red diamond shows the difference between the blue and the green line, or the point where $1 more of added input cost in fertilizer does not return $1 in grain. The profitable range is a plus or minus $1 value, as that curve is very flat at those points near that response function. At these parameters with a price ratio of 0.1, the MRTN rate for Minnesota for corn, flax, soybeans is 123 pounds, and the profitable N rate range is from 110 to 138 pounds of nitrogen per acre. Over on the far left, it shows charts that we can look at. We can look at the return to nitrogen, which is here, the percent of maximum yield that would be attained at a specific rate, the economic optimum nitrogen rate frequency, and the relationship between optimum nitrogen rate and yield. We'll look at that now. This is the frequency distribution of economic nitrogen rates. It would be great if all these frequency bars fell within our recommendation range, but in biological systems, and as many of you know, nitrogen management is not that easy. This shows the percentage of sites that fall within in the database that fall within the optimum nitrogen rate range from 25 up to 225 pounds. You can see that the majority of the sites fit this bell-shaped curve and fall within that 75 to 150 pounds of nitrogen. This is part of the reason for our recommendation guidelines. Ideally, we'd like to see 100% of the sites, but when we err on the right side, we're spending dollars that in many years would not be necessary. When we err on the left side of this graph and apply a rate that's greater than that site required, we set ourselves up for potential nitrogen losses and environmental concerns. As you can see, our rate guidelines are from 123 to 138 is the profitable range, and this encompasses about 75 to 80% of all sites in the database. The other thing that's important to understand is that some states, and Minnesota historically years ago, used a yield goal rate recommendation function, where with higher yields, we put on higher nitrogen rates. When you look at this at the database of end response trials, you see that there's really no relationship between optimum yield at a given optimum nitrogen rate, optimum yield being on the y-axis, and the economic optimum rate on the x-axis. If this yield goal-based function is correct, there should be a strong linear correlation in these site data, and there clearly is not. And that is the reason why we use the recommendation system that we do, and we do not use a yield goal-based nitrogen rate recommendation system in this 7-state area. If you take the data from the N rate calculator, you can create a table such as this, with previous crop on the left, various nitrogen price to corn price ratios in the middle, and the MRTN and the profitable N rate range is shown there. Often and frequently, our optimum price ratio is around 0.10, in this case displayed by 35 cents pounds of nitrogen and $3.50 corn. This year, we may be at a slightly higher ratio than that, and in previous years, we were at a slightly lower ratio than that. But these ratios affect the optimum rate and the optimum maximum return to nitrogen based on that database. So now let's get into some of the data. First of all, we're going to talk about the nitrogen rate and timing. These are the 12 detailed site year studies. 8 of these sites were in the Karst region, and 4 were on transition soils that are just west of the Karst region, but drain their water from these fields drain into the same watershed. These transition soils are somewhat poorly drained, and the Karst region soils are well drained and underlie this fractured bedrock. These studies were just nitrogen fertilizer treatments applied as urea with an NBPT at planting. NBPT is a urease inhibitor. In this trial, we worked with farmers to time these applications at planting. Sometimes we would apply a few days before to be convenient for them, and sometimes a few days later after planting. So it was important that we used a urease inhibitor to minimize the potential for volatilization losses of that nitrogen until either tillage or a rainfall could incorporate that nitrogen. These studies had 7 of the 10 treatments were nitrogen rates from 0 to 180 pounds in 30-pound increments for corn falling corn, or for corn falling soybean, and 0 to 270 pounds for corn falling corn. 3 of the treatments were split applications that range from 30 to 45 pounds of nitrogen per acre at planting, and the remainder was broadcast as urea with NBPT between V4 and V6, or conventional side dress time. These studies had very detailed measurements. We looked at soil inorganic nitrogen with a pre-plant nitrogen test, looking at nitrate and ammonium to 2-foot depth, a pre-side dress nitrate test at V4, and a post-harvest, or looking at residual soil nitrate, inorganic nitrogen from a 0 to 4-foot depth. And this was done after harvest in October, early November. At detailed plant sampling, we counted plant populations. We looked at nitrogen in-season status in the corn using the SPAD meter and also aerial imagery. And we also took whole plant samples at physiological maturity to look at the nitrogen content in the plant parts, the stover, the grain, and also the total nitrogen uptake in the plant. We also looked at basal stock nitrate as a measure of whether there was luxury nitrogen available for that plant at the time. From a grain standpoint, we looked at yield, moisture, and nitrogen content and uptake in the grain and removal. So let's look at some of the data. This is a study site in the Grand Meadow area in 2018. This is corn yield and residual soil nitrate as affected by nitrogen rate and timing. On the left y-axis, we have grain yield. On the x-axis, we have nitrogen rate from the 7 different fixed nitrogen rates. And on the y-axis, we have the residual soil nitrate after harvest. The black circles are the pre-plant nitrogen rates from 0 to 180 pounds at this location. The red triangles are the split applied treatments where 30 pounds was applied at planting and the remainder of that total N rate was applied at side dress. And the diamond shows the maximum return to nitrogen at this location, 156 pounds, as predicted by the quadratic response plateau model, which is the white line. The green circles, or the green squares, are the residual soil nitrate. What we would expect to see is residual soil nitrate to increase slightly as we get greater than the maximum return to nitrogen. At this location, that was very minimal. At this location, we also had a significant amount of rainfall. We see that the MRTN at this site is slightly greater than our recommended range, and it is not unusual to see that at some locations. We also noticed that we saw response to side dress or split applications at this location. The circled red triangles show yields that were greater than the pre-plant circles at these specific nitrogen rates. This next location, we're looking at corn yield residual soil nitrate as affected by N rate at another location in 2018. This was also corn falling soybean. At this site, we see our MRTN at 128 pounds. No differences between the split applied nitrogen and the pre-plant nitrogen. And the other thing that's very clear is once we receive or apply rates that are greater than our MRTN or our optimum, we see residual soil nitrate increasing, especially at the 180 pound rate at this location. This state chart is very busy and shows lots of information and all the MRTN calculations and model parameters from all the N-rate trials in the database and are in this study. A couple things I want to bring to your attention is on the left, it has the site, the previous crop, and then the incidental nitrogen. Many of these locations had some nitrogen already applied before we applied our treatments. In some instances, like the GM16 site, as much as 50 pounds had been applied. And this was nitrogen that either came from ammoniated fertilizers that were applied the previous fall or from starter fertilizers. This does affect the amount of optimum nitrogen that's needed at any of these locations, but we did include that nitrogen in our calculations of optimum nitrogen rate. It's easier to look at this data in a graphical format, and that's what we have here. This is the nitrogen rate response or optimum nitrogen rates for the corn falling soybean sites. There's 6 locations. On the y-axis, we have yield. On the x-axis, we have total nitrogen rate, including incidental nitrogen. The shaded box is the MRTN profitable rate range. Ideally, we'd like to see the dots, the colored circles, or the optimum nitrogen rate at each individual location fall within that recommended range. We see that 2 sites are within that box. 1 site is just below, and 2 sites are 15 and 18 pounds greater than that recommended range. The response functions are the individual lines from each individual location. In general, our recommended range performed well. The yellow and blue sites fall just slightly greater than our recommended range, but as you see, these response functions are fairly flat, and a rate applied near the maximum of the recommended range, say like 130 to 138 pounds of nitrogen, would have resulted in anywhere from 96 to 97% of maximum yield, and only a dollar or two from economic optimum return. The green site, which was Grand Meadow in 2017, had a much higher nitrogen recommendation, and we'll talk more about that in a moment. These are the N rate response functions and the optimum nitrogen rates for the corn-on-corn site. Here, we see a greater spread in the optimum nitrogen rates as calculated by the models. We have 1 site, yellow, falling within our MRTN profitable range, 2 sites that are just below, the black and the green, and the 1 site, the red, that's considerably below. That site was a site that was corn-on-corn and followed a dry year the previous year. That would have been 2015, and had greater carryover nitrogen as was evident in the pre-plant soil nitrate test, and it required less nitrogen than our recommendation. The purple and the blue sites were both sites that were in 2018 and required greater nitrogen than our current recommendation. Let's look into why that was. This table is extraordinarily busy, but the idea is this is the monthly precip as a percent of the 30-year normal for each month at each site year during this 12-site year study. I've color-coded the months to make it easier to understand which ones had excessive rainfall, which would have contributed to greater leaching and denitrification. The yellow cells, our values, are months that were between 125 and 150% of normal annual rainfall. The red cells are ones that are greater than 150% of normal rainfall for a given month at that location. At the top of each site heading, we see 3 of them have an emblem greater than 20 pounds, which means that the optimum nitrogen rate at that location was greater than 20 pounds of nitrogen above our current profitable N rate range, or the maximum of our profitable N rate range. When we look at the HM18 and UT18 sites, we see that those sites were dominated by 4 or 5 months of greater than 150% normal. In fact, the HM18 site had 4 months with greater than 200% of normal rainfall. Clearly, this was a site that received an intense amount of rainfall early and throughout the growing season, resulting in significant nitrogen loss to leaching and denitrification, and would have been an excellent candidate for a supplemental nitrogen application if this research study was not being doing. So how does the grower deal with this? I think the key thing is to recognize when these incidences happen and when you have significant excessive rainfall in the early part of the growing season, maybe primarily in May and June, and try to make a correction to that nitrogen application in late June or early July, when that rescue treatment could still benefit that crop and increase yields and hopefully increase profitability to the grower. The GM17 site was another location that had greater than 20 pounds. The economic optimum was greater than 20 pounds above our current recommendation. This site is unique in that this didn't show up until later in the growing season, as we'll see in a moment. And then there was also some interesting that this site had resulted in a very cool and dry August, which probably limited nitrogen mineralization from the organic matter. This is that site, GM 2017. This is the crop response, grain yield on the y-axis, nitrogen rate on the x-axis, and you see the response function and the diamond showing a maximum return to nitrogen of 203 pounds at this location. Also note that this was a location where the split applied N treatments performed better and yielded better and actually produced equal yields to the pre-plant at 180. The split applied treatment at 150 actually was a greater economic return. At the same location, we looked at relative leaf chlorophyll at R1 to see the nitrogen status during the in-season. And it was interesting that at this location, the nitrogen status at R1 showed that 150 pounds of nitrogen was probably going to be sufficient, as we did not see chlorophyll content increase, relative chlorophyll content increase above that level with higher nitrogen rates at that time. So this suggests that much of the nitrogen loss or lack of nitrogen fertility that resulted in that higher economic optimum N rate occurred later in the growing season after the R1, and probably was related in two parts. One, to the fact that we had a cool, dry August, which limited the amount of mineralization of N for the organic matter. And secondly, this plot received 30 pounds credit of incidental N from DAP and starter fertilizer, and the DAP was applied in early October of the previous year, and likely that nitrogen was lost prior to this crop growing. To summarize the response, 6 of the 12 sites had optimum nitrogen rates that were greater than the max of the profitable N rate range. We would expect it to be better than that. But 3 of the 12 sites, the optimum N rate was only 20 pounds greater than the max of the profitable N rate range. So when you look at the frequency distribution in the bottom, we see that looking at that, we're looking at about 75 to 80% of the sites that are in the database fall within that optimum nitrogen profitable range. So of those sites that were just slightly greater, those 3, that falls within those parameters. One of these sites had a 25-pound N credit from DAP, which was applied in early October, and the other 2, as we discussed earlier, had excessive rainfall during the growing season and would have been likely candidates for a supplemental nitrogen application based on those information. So what can the grower do? It's important that we start with the optimum nitrogen rate based on the nitrogen rate calculator, and then monitor the conditions of the growing season and address issues like excessive rainfall later in the season or as an in-season application as a rescue treatment or as a mid-season nitrogen application. And this can be done using tools, or it can be done using the grower and their ag advisors' experiences. The question was, once split application superior to at planting at these sites? Grain yields were greater with split applied N at 3 of the 12 locations. Those sites are listed at the bottom. That yield increase ranged from 7 to 9 bushels at these 3 locations. And in some instances at these locations, that yield was greater with a lower nitrogen rate when using split application. Interestingly, the relative leaf chlorophyll content at R1 showed greater chlorophyll content with split applications than at planting nitrogen applications in 7 of 12 years. So it showed the potential for split applications to improve nitrogen management, but yields were only increased in 3 of 12 site years. So how about water quality parameters? This chart looks at the residual soil nitrate normalized for the optimum nitrogen rate in the corn after soybean sites. So on the x-axis, we take the nitrogen rate applied at multiple rates at each of these 7 treatments. And we subtract off what the optimum nitrogen rate was, and then we chart or graph on the y-axis the effects of that nitrogen rate above the optimum on residual soil nitrate. And what we see is at these 6 corn after soybean sites, 3 of these locations saw a significant increase in residual soil nitrate as the N rate approached the optimum nitrogen rate and exceeded the optimum nitrogen rate by as much as 60 or 70 pounds. In some cases, the residual soil nitrate increased 100 to 200% at optimum nitrogen rates in excess of optimum. This is the residual soil nitrate for the corn after corn sites. We see a wider range on the x-axis of rates. Again, we've subtracted the optimum nitrogen rate, or the MRTN value, from the rates applied and are looking at rates that exceed MRTN. And we see at 2 of the 6 sites a significant increase, the black and the red lines, for nitrogen rates that exceeded the optimum. But this does not occur at every location. You see the green and yellow locations are sites that did not see an increase at nitrogen rates that exceeded the optimum. This is usually related to weather. If it happens to be a wet summer or late summer or early fall, some of that nitrogen is already released below that 4-foot root sampling depth for those fall soil samples. So what were the water quality impacts? For corn after soybean, residual soil nitrate increased in 3 of the 6 sites when N rates exceeded the optimum nitrogen rate. At the corn on corn sites, RSN increased at 2 of the 6 sites when N rates were at least 50 pounds greater than the optimum. But recognize that 3 of the 12 sites, the optimum nitrogen rate was near the max applied. Therefore, we would not expect accumulation of residual soil nitrate in those locations. How about the in-stream monitoring of water quality in the region? This is the Root River Field to Stream Partnership. This is the Root River watershed, and it's a very diverse watershed, and it runs from the western edge of the southeast region to the mouth of the Mississippi near Hoka. In the western side of this watershed, we have glacial till soils that are somewhat poorly drained and have tile drainage. Several of our research sites were in this portion of the area, and this water drains into the south branch of the river near Ostrander. Down here in the Crystal Creek watershed, which is part of the Karst region, we also had research sites in this area near Harmony. This water drains into the Root River also in that south area, but this is part of the Karst region where this water is connected with groundwater and is more challenging. Over here in the eastern section is where the bluffland is. This is a region where we have the Bridge Creek watershed, which is part of the Root River watershed. But this is a region where there is a less percentage of the acres of the farmland in this watershed are in crop production, especially row crop production. It's dominated more by the bluffland, wooded areas, pastures, and river valleys. So there's a lower percentage of cropland, especially corn and soybeans in this region of this watershed. When we look at the in-stream nitrate nitrogen loads in this Root River watershed, we see different results depending upon which region of the watershed we are in. When we look at the glacial till study area, from 2010 through 2017, our nitrate nitrogen load ranged from a low in the drought year of 2012 of only 6 pounds of nitrate per acre to a high in 2016, an extraordinarily wet year, of 53 pounds of nitrogen per acre. Generally, the range in nitrate load in this watershed, a watershed that is dominated by corn and soybean production and somewhat poorly drained soils with tile drainage, it's controlled by the amount of tile drainage in the watershed and the amount of runoff or the amount of precipitation when the soils are vulnerable to runoff and leaching through the tiles. Compare that to the Karst study area at the bottom. And you see a lot of the same similarities. Dry years like 2012 have very low nitrate loads. The nitrate load ranged in this region from 4 to 34 part per million, or 4 to 34 pounds per acre. But the relationships are similar to the glacial till area. But recognize that in the karst region, these nitrogen loads are delivered to surface waters, but also the nitrogen leaching through the permeable soils in this area ends up in groundwater as well. When we go to the Bluffland study area, we see very low levels of nitrate load in the river. And that is partly and primarily due to the fact that we are now getting this dilution effect from groundwater sources in these streams and rivers. The water infiltrates in the karst region, and in some of the Bluffland regions returns from groundwater to these streams and dilutes the nitrate load in this watershed, part of the watershed. But also it's important to note that in this Bluffland area where we have less corn and soybeans, the overall nitrate load is considerably less because of land use and the amount of crop production that's in that region. If we just look at the western portion of that Root River watershed, the region that has tile drainage and poorly drained soils, these data are from an edge of field study on one of the farmers' fields that participated in the Southeast Minnesota NBMP project. Initially, his corn and soybean production, he applied 170 pounds of nitrogen pre-plant. He changed his practices during the course of the study to applying 130 pounds as a split rate application, with some at planting and the rest at side dress. Statistically, these models are not significantly different, but there's a trend towards a reduction in nitrate concentration and load in his fields and exiting his tile lines after this change in production practices. So one of the common questions that growers have is, if I adopt these MRTN nitrogen rates or reduce my nitrogen rates, will it affect my corn yields over time? And specifically, the question is, will yields decline if I use lower rates? To answer this question, we looked at data from a multi-year nitrogen rate timing and nitrogen rate study that was done near Rochester in southeastern Minnesota on a Port Byron siltloam soil. In this study, that was a multi-year project, we put the same nitrogen fertilizer rates on the same plots every year in either a corn-soybean rotation or corn after corn. And the treatments are listed below, very similar to the studies that were done on farmers' fields. The nitrogen rate response from the 5-year study in southeastern Minnesota showed that our greatest optimum nitrogen rate occurred in 2006. And in other years, our optimum rates fell in this site within our recommended range. And 1 year, the last year of the study, 2010, the optimum rate was significantly less than our recommended range. This data slightly suggests that there is not an issue with performing these same treatments over and over in the same spot, and that the climate and the individual growing conditions in a given season is going to have a greater impact on the optimum nitrogen rate in a given year than whether or not there's residual effects of year-to-year application of reduced rates. We also had a corn after corn site, and in the corn after corn, the first year, 2007, also had one of the higher nitrogen demands, as outlined here in this red response curve. And then the other 2 years, 2008, 2009, fell within our respective range, and the 2010, or last year of the study, was slightly greater. So what is our take-home message? Our goal from this research and education efforts was to try to improve profitability and water quality by increasing adoption of nitrogen NBMPs in this region. How did we get there, or how did we do this? We worked with our growers, and we also educated them to encourage them to apply appropriate nitrogen rates using the nitrogen guidelines based on the MRTN database, and using BMPs for source, timing, and placement, or the 4 R's. We encourage them to resist applying pre-plant nitrogen rates that are considerably greater than the profitable N-rate range, or the maximum of the profitable N-rate range for Minnesota. To do this, as insurance against N-loss, results in the potential for greater nitrogen contamination of surface and groundwaters in this region. But we recognize that there are years when greater nitrogen rates are needed, and we've seen that in our data. What we need to do then in those situations, when weather conditions result in significant nitrogen loss, is the growers need to use other tools, work with their fertilizer dealer to correct those problems with in-season and applications using supplemental nitrogen. And those nitrogen applications can have a greater nitrogen use efficiency and also increase profitability when necessary. But the key is to do it when necessary and not to put those rates out earlier in the growing season as insurance against loss, because that will just lead to greater nitrogen losses in surface and groundwaters and also poor profitability. The authors would like to acknowledge our funding sources, the Minnesota Department of Ag and Clean Water Fund for financial assistance for this project, the Southeast Minnesota Water Resources Board who administered this grant, the Root River Field to Stream Partnership for supporting and providing data on water quality, and all the participating farmers and ag advisors that participated in this study and continue to participate and collaborate on this effort. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeffrey, for sharing all of this valuable information with us today. We do have some time for Q&A, so attendees, please enter your questions into the question box on your screen for Jeff. And the first question that we'll get started with is there any effort to modify MRTN based on rainfall incidents during the growing season?
So the question is there any incentive to modify MRTN based on rainfall? At this time, there is not, but each state does have other tools that are available. The University of Minnesota has what's called the Supplemental N worksheet. And basically, it's just a simple kind of a checkbook method where we look at the crop's condition at a given time in the spring, the amount of rainfall that was applied or that has been received, if it's excessive or not, and then also the timing and the end sources that were used. And this simple checkbook method can kind of give you a score that can help you relate to whether or not you believe you've had enough loss to justify a supplemental N application. Other states have incorporated some other tools. There's things like the pre-sidedress or late sidedress nitrate test as a method to look at nitrogen availability at sidedress time to see if a rate correction needs to be made. And there are a few states that are using or developing sensors and other tools. And of course, we do have crop models that help predict nitrogen loss and that could be used prior to sidedress time to make a correction, or later in the growing season to make a rescue and treatment.
Next question is, are all N research sites farmed conventionally, i.e. any sites where cover crops like cereal rye are being used every year?
That's a good question. In the NMI project, there were some sites that had cover crops because those were sites that growers, that was one of the things that growers wanted to look at in the NMI was the cover crop relationships. In our 12 nitrogen rate trials, none of those sites had cover crops the previous year. They were conventionally farmed and all those applications of nitrogen were spring.
Okay, next question is, should manure N be valued on its application cost per unit of N for MRTN?
So how manure is handled in Minnesota is a little bit different. The value of it is difficult because some growers can put a dollar value on it if they're purchasing it from a neighbor farmer, but others, it's more difficult to put an economic value to that manure nutrients. And of course, you have the total nitrogen available in the manure, and then you also have the available nitrogen that has to be calculated. So if the grower chose to, they could put a dollar value for that manure, but that's not necessarily part of the manure management plan. The manure management plans look at it just a little bit differently, and the recommended rates are based on a different corn nitrogen price to corn price ratio, usually at the 0.05 ratio.
Next question is, with precipitation over 150% of normal, isn't it safe to say that you're going to see leaching of N no matter what the rate is?
Definitely. when you see excessive precipitation, especially in the months of May and June, there is likely to be leaching of nitrogen as that nitrogen nitrifies from the source, if we can keep it in the ammonium source longer, we can protect it against leaching, but once it's in the nitrate form, which it generally is by late May and June with most of our spring applications, leaching is definitely going to occur when you have excess rainfall, and especially in the situation at one of those sites where we had 5 months with greater than 200% of normal rainfall. As far as the effect on the nitrogen rate and how that's going to affect leaching, the greater the nitrogen rate that's out there, the more N, or the greater amount of N of that portion is going to be leached and lost. So applying a higher rate might seem like an insurance against nitrogen loss, but you're just going to end up with a larger percent of that nitrogen lost and may still need a rescue or supplemental N application if that losses are significant.
Next question is, what was the soil organic matter and CEC in the study?
Yeah, so the 12 site years ranged in organic matter content from probably right around 3% in some of the lowest sites in that Karst region to as much as 5.5% in some of the soils that were in the western part of that watershed, which is the transition soils where there's higher clay content. What was the second part to the question, Julia? Oh, the CEC? It ranged from
the CEC.
It ranged from the high teens at some sites to the mid to upper 20s of milliequivalents per 100 cc's of soil in the western part of that watershed. But the mid 20s is typical for these soils.
Okay, next question is, how would you rate the basal stock nitrogen test relative to the post-season soil nitrate to look at excess nitrogen?
Yeah, they're both tools. I feel that the residual soil nitrate test gives you a more accurate assessment, but it is influenced by the amount of rainfall that occurs in the fall or late part of the growing season. The residual soil, or the stock nitrate test, the difficulty with that is the timing of taking it and making sure that it's within 2 weeks of physiological maturity in the plant. And then also, if there's stock quality issues or poor plant health at that time, then the test is less effective and more variable. And in general, the variability that we see, even in these small research plot trials with the basal stock nitrate test, lends itself to suggest that it raises concerns about the amount of variability that we see in that test. The residual soil nitrate test, generally, when you have N rates that are at least 30 or greater pounds greater than the optimum, we see an accumulation of nitrate in the soil, and it's usually fairly consistent.
Okay, next question is, most city sewage plants have overflows that dump into rivers. Wouldn't that also add to the rise in numbers after a rain?
Yeah, so it depends upon the municipalities, but certainly when they get excessive amounts of rainfall, they may have to, or they have the ability to maybe release some raw sewage into the rivers, and that certainly could affect the nutrient content. But they're regulated, and those releases are documented. And when they look at monitoring wells and monitoring stations in the rivers, it could be attributed to those types of releases that would raise those concentrations and loads in those regions.
Next question. How do you recommend accounting for N from previous cover crop in your N application rate the following year?
Yeah, so that's a tough question. We've done some research here in Minnesota looking at credits for cover crops, and it's not very consistent. If you use something like cereal rye and you terminate it a week or two before planting corn, in my experience, it's generally a slight negative and there is no credit. It's actually a negative. But if you use other species of cover crops, brassicas, legumes, then there usually is a modest credit. But it varies with climatic conditions, with termination date, and with the amount of biomass that is developed. It's complicated, and at this point, I do not believe that researchers have all the answers to those cover crop nitrogen questions.
Next question, where can we go to use the nitrogen rate calculator, and does it account for organic matter?
So the nitrogen rate calculator, you can Google nitrogen rate calculator, or on one of my slides, I had the link at the bottom. If you have any questions about it, you can contact John Sawyer at Iowa State University. He's the one that kind of takes care of it, and is the manager of the calculator. As far as what was the second part of the question, Julia?
Does it account for organic matter?
So in some states, there are productivity bases and criteria. In some states, there's also geographic breakdowns for different rates of nitrogen using the calculator in different regions of the state. And those can be attributed to organic matter, but it's not a direct contribution. Like there's not a constant or value that you would input into the calculator at a certain organic matter that would influence the amount of nitrogen dramatically. So it's really given more by the geography and the soils in that geography, and then maybe their productivity ratings and adjustments for those.
Okay, last question is, does the University of Minnesota suggest soil health tests like the Haney? Can we use cover crops to make N and other nutrients more available to the next crop that doesn't show up using traditional soil testing mechanisms?
So I'll take the first part of that first. Does the university recommend the Haney test for a soil health test? Well, I think the Haney test can be used for a soil health test, and it can give you an idea of the quality, the amount of nitrogen that might be available from that organic matter during that burst test. But we have to use caution because that test is not correlated and calibrated for many of our nutrients that we use, or we use other soil tests to determine the amount of phosphorus, say, or potassium or sulfur that would be applied. So that test is really more of a soil quality measurement. It's more of a qualitative test, and its applicability as a soil test that's more wide, with wide uses of multiple nutrients would be somewhat limiting. Can you repeat the second portion?
Yeah, the second part is, can we use cover crops to make nitrogen and other nutrients more available to the next crop that doesn't show up using traditional soil testing mechanisms?
Yeah, so cover crops are good at scavenging nutrients that could be lost when the crop, the for-profit crop is not out there. And they're also excellent at protecting our soils during that same period. Depending upon the species, those nutrients can be recycled back to that crop, but it's critical that the timing is right for that crop, for the next crop's needs, so that those nutrients are released when that subsequent crop can utilize them. So yes, that they can be used to help garner and sequester nutrients, but recognize that the efficiency of their use is not going to be 100%. Sometimes they're not going to be available for that subsequent crop, and may still either be immobilized in the soil in that residue or be lost due to other situations.
Okay, and we have one more question that just came through. How are these trial results viewed by the farmers who participated in the study? Will they make any changes in 2019?
Yeah, that's a great question, and one thing that I didn't talk a lot about in the presentation, but we are doing survey information about every year, every other year, working with these growers, talking to them, getting their inputs on whether or not this data and this information and our education and research efforts is having an impact on their management practices. I gave an example of just one grower who reduced his nitrogen rate from 170 pounds for corn following soybeans to 130, and also changed to a split application. We have yet to detail all that information and put it into a package that we could give and present, but we are definitely monitoring that and looking at the impact of these changes and this education and research effort on practices in the area. Ultimately, we would like to see the effects in our water quality parameters, but the geology of this area makes that very difficult. This integration in the karst topography of ground and surface waters makes measuring differences in water quality in streams and rivers very complicated, and it's likely that it's going to be difficult for our efforts to be measured in water quality monitoring in that region.
All right. In the interest of time, I'd like to wrap up the Q&A. I want to thank you again, Jeff, for joining us today. We really appreciate you taking the time to share your work.
Thank you.
At this time, I want to recognize our premier egg retailer members, the Andersons, a gold member, and silver members, Gertie Egg and Nutrien Egg Solutions. Their contributions helped make this webinar possible and help promote the strides that egg retailers like you are making to reduce nutrient impairments. I would also like to acknowledge our participating egg retailers that represent more than 4 million acres in both the Great Lakes and Mississippi River basins. If you are an egg retailer in either the Great Lakes Basin or Mississippi River Basin that is interested in becoming a member or participating with PARM to receive tools and resources to increase sales and information on our latest cost shares, please contact our project manager at caitlin@partnershipfarm.org or visit our website and click Become a Member to fill out our online form. Finally, I'd like to acknowledge additional funders and collaborators that made this webinar possible. In particular, the Great Lakes Protection Fund, the McKnight Foundation, and Clean Lakes Alliance. Datu Research has recently published egg retailer and producer cover crop case studies. These case studies include important information on integrating cover crops into a business model, experiences when first offering and managing cover crops, challenges, and soil health benefits. You can find these on the PARM website under the Egg Retailer tab. Please remember to take our survey. If you have not already received an email in the past week, look for the link in our follow-up email and on our website, partnershipfarm.org. Again, this survey is vital for our egg industry and your location. Let us help you boost your brand and communicate to important stakeholders and industry members what egg retailers are doing to improve water quality. Please note that names and locations are kept anonymous in our aggregate survey reports. As we wrap up, please remember to look for the follow-up email in a few days with a webinar evaluation and webinar recording. If you submitted your CCA number at registration and are viewing this webinar live, or the recording within 2 weeks of the original date, your CEUs will be automatically submitted. Only if you are watching the recording more than 2 weeks after the original broadcast date will you need to email julia@partnershipfarm.org your CCA number to ensure your CEUs are submitted. I want to thank you all again for joining us today and hope you join us again for our next 2 webinars in February.